So far in this unit, we have been worrying about how to model the market to predict what are the type of allocations and prices that it generates under different parameters, and to study things like comparative statics, what happens to the equilibrium prices and allocation if we change some deep parameter of the economy like technology or tastes. What we're going to do for the rest of the unit is extend the tools of producer surplus and consumer surplus to be able to answer a very basic question, which is, what is the total level of well-being as measured by total utility in the economy generated by the market? And we're going to derive what I consider a beautiful result, which is just by looking at the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram, we're going to be able to answer this question, even if we have no knowledge of what the underlying utility functions or cost functions are. So I hope you like it. Remember the definition of an allocation, which we denoted by alpha, which is just a list for every consumer of how much they consume of good X and good M, and this is for every consumer, and then for every firm, how much they produce of good X and how much of the M good they used in production. Okay, that was a complete description of an allocation. We're going to denote by alpha I what is the utility of the consumer at what it gets in the allocation in the definition that follows. Now, definition is a very important definition. The social surplus of an allocation alpha, any allocation, notice this doesn't have to be a market allocation, is equal to the sum over all consumers of the benefit that they get from consuming the amount of good X that they get, minus the sum over all of the firms of the cost of producing whatever is it that they produce. That is the definition of social surplus. Notice one important thing in the definition, which is that we are going to assume that all firm owners, to an assumption, are included among the consumers. So all of the profits are going to be, in the model that we're about to develop, distributed by one consumer. Notice that this is with a lot less generality than it sounds, because if you're looking at a market in which maybe the firm owners do not buy in the market, you can model them simply as having a benefit function of 0, as having no benefit. And so pure owners, notice I can model pure owners as consumers with the utility of XM is just M. And that allows, without loss of generality, to really encompass everybody that is either consuming or owning some profits as part of the consumer population. And that's important as we go forward. So here is an important result that gives us an intuition of what this social surplus measure. And I claim that social surplus of the allocation alpha is just equal to the sum over all consumers of the utility that they get at the allocation alpha, which remember is given by what they consume of X and M. Let's see that is the case. So why is the case, or proof? Well, notice that the sum over all consumers of U alpha I is just substituting the functional form for the utility function given the quasi-linearity, Bi of Xiz plus Miz. But we can rewrite this as the sum over I, Bi Xiz, we pass the sum there, and then I'm going to span the sum over I of all the Miz's. What is the total amount of good M that gets consumed? Is the sum over I of their wealth minus how much it is spent in producing the good J. So the good X by all of the firms. So it's the sum over all firms j, so j equals 1 to f, of the cost for that firm of producing whatever is it that they produce. Now, where does that come from? This follows from the feasibility constraint. So for any feasible allocation, this has to be the case. So if you wish to be precise, alpha feasible allocation. Okay. Now, what do we have? Well, this is just equal to the social surplus of alpha plus the sum of I, Wi, and this is a constant. So we get that the social surplus of alpha, I'm sorry, I forgot to write here, is equal to the sum of utilities plus a constant. What that means is that as you change the allocation, it varies with the sum of the utilities plus a constant. So it's proportional to the sum of the utilities. Now, several quick remarks about this result. First is that the constant is not just any arbitrary constant, it's actually by the sum of the endowments or wealths of good M that all consumers in the economy have. Notice that that number is a constant because it doesn't change as you change the allocation in the market. The second is, notice what this is telling us. This result is very remarkable because it's telling us that this measure of social surplus that we just built, which just basically is the sum of the benefits minus the cost, it doesn't include the ends, it actually tells us how the utilities are varying, the sum of the utilities, the total size of the pie, as we vary the allocation. In some sense, to know how total utility is changing, we don't have to worry about the distribution of M, and that is very useful. The third thing that I want you to notice is that this result, this precise result, is not completely general. It really depends on the quasi-linearity assumption. And I want to give you an intuition for why. When you have quasi-linear preferences of the form ux of m equals b of x plus m, it means that you can take 1 unit of m from one person and give it to another and decrease the utility of one person by 1 unit and increase the utility of another person by exactly 1 unit. There is what is called transferable utility. That is not always the case in more general models. And that simplifies a lot of things because it means that kind of the total amount of m that there is to consume doesn't really matter. What matters is how much do we take away for production and what is the general benefits that it generates. That's what determines what happens to the sum of the utilities. And to be precise, that is what determines how, as you move the allocation, for example, as you build more or less X and you distribute it differently across the people, how the total utility changes. Now, the previous result was for any feasible allocation. Now I want to generate another result, claim, which is a functional form for what is the social surplus for an alpha star, and this is going to be a market allocation. And by market, I mean free trade. Claim, this is going to be equal to the consumer surplus on the market at the market price plus the producer surplus at the market level, at the aggregate producer surplus, at that price. So let me prove that why that is the case. So why is that the case? So let's start by writing down what is social surplus at alpha star. By definition is equal to the sum over all consumers of BI, the benefit that they get, at the quantity that they get at the market, minus the sum, and I'm going to write the minus, well, let me write it here, minus the sum over all of the firms of the cost of producing whatever is it that they are supplying at the market equilibrium. That's a star, by the way. Okay, now what I'm going to do is take this term, I'm going to write that in red, and add two terms, minus P star times the sum of I xid star plus P star, the sum over j xj d star. Notice that this adds up to 0 because this is aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Sorry, there is a typo there. That's an S. And therefore, they are up to 0. But what that allows me to do is that by taking that term and that term, notice that that is equal to the sum over I, using again those two terms, of the consumer surplus of I at P star, and then using that term minus that term, plus the sum over the firms on the producer surplus for firm J at P star. But this is just equal, by definition of aggregate consumer surplus and producer surplus, to the consumer surplus at the market level at P star plus the producer surplus at the market level at P star. So we have now a way, or market allocations, and only for market allocations characterized by free trade, to computing the social surplus generated by the market allocation as a sum of consumer and producer surplus, which are two concepts that we know how to compute. Now, let's see how to represent this social surplus graphically. So suppose that we have our aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. So let's say we have aggregate demand that looks like this, aggregate supply that looks like this. We know for this market that this is the equilibrium price, this is the equilibrium quantity, the total amount produced, and we also know that this area is the consumer surplus at P star. We know in the aggregate, so for the market, we know that this area is the producer surplus for the market at P star. Seen this before, and what we just proven is that both areas together, all of this, so is the social surplus at P star, which is just the consumer surplus at P star at the market plus the producer surplus at P star at the market. Let me emphasize an aspect of this that to me is very beautiful, which is that suppose we wanted to ask the question, what is the total utility up to a constant produced by the market allocation? And you can imagine wanting to ask that question as different market conditions on these parameters changes. We can, by looking at the aggregate supply and demand diagram, provide an answer to that question without knowing what the utilities are or the cost functions are, and still know that as long as the firms are maximizing their costs, the profits, and the consumers are rational in the way that we define in Unit 2, this provides really a good measure of the total utility at that allocation. To me, that's beautiful. We don't need to know the cost functions or the utility functions to answer the question. Let me finish with 3 remarks. The first one is that our measure of consumer surplus for the market plus producer surplus for the market is proportional to the sum of the true utilities, through the experience utilities for all people, only if decision utility is equal to experience utility plus a constant. In other words, only if people are, when they're making decisions and generating market behavior, are maximizing the true experience utilities. This is something that we saw in the final part of Unit 2, and it should be quite intuitive. If people are maximizing the wrong thing, the marginal benefit function that is implicit in their behavior is not the true one that is capturing utility, and therefore the measure of the consumer surplus is going to be off. If you understood the material of mistakes in Section 2, this should be obvious. If not, I urge you to go back and take another look at it. The second point that I want you to emphasize is that social surplus is a measure of the total utility pie. It basically measures how much total utility there is to distribute across all of the consumers, but is silent about distributional issues. And in particular, it could be that the market can generate very inequitable allocations that have a very total size. This measure will not capture that. We're going to get back to issues of distribution in the next unit. And the final thing I want to emphasize, warning, because this leads to a lot of problems in applications and in problem sets. This formula that the social surplus is equal to the consumer surplus at the market plus the producer surplus of the market only applies, I know I'm repeating myself, but this is a very common mistake, only applies at free trade. If you are in a problem that doesn't have pure free trade, you have to think carefully, go back to the fundamentals to know exactly what social surplus looks like in that case.